The climate crisis has been described as a race against time. Huge protests have swept the globe, united in calls demanding action from leaders. The world's leading scientists claim there is now less than 12 years for global warming to be kept to a maximum limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius and avoid the most catastrophic effects of climate change. But efforts to cut down on the use of fossil fuels have stalled. Although there has been investment in renewable energy, solar and wind, the vast majority of global energy, some 80%, still comes from fossil fuels. But one answer to this increasingly desperate problem could be hiding in plain sight. Engineers in Calgary claim they have found a clean and economically viable way to produce hydrogen. And it all started with a chance conversation over a breakfast at a Denny's restaurant on the outskirts of Calgary in Alberta, Canada.
I did an engineering master's about 12 years earlier, and one of my professors I took a few courses from, Ian Gates, he and I stayed friends for many years and would have fairly regular breakfasts before we went to work.
We often talked about ideas that we had about how we can go beyond the current. How do we go beyond what exists today?
We talk about all sorts of different interesting theoretical ways to solve problems.
And that kind of discussion, either at breakfast or at a pub, leads to a sense of, and even with only 2 people or 3 people can lead to that sense of critical mass, which leads to new ideas and new discoveries.
At one point, I wanted to buy a big asset somewhere, and our main shareholder at the time didn't want to buy this big resource asset. So I was lamenting this to Ian, saying, oh, I wish we could go get this. Just the size of it is just unbelievable.
Part of this is, how do we produce from these resources energy, but produce clean energy from these resources?
And he said, I was just looking at a paper where there was a bunch of hydrogen produced in an old pilot.
The idea was at first, well, how do we lower the emissions intensity of oil sands? But then how do we get to the point of zero emissions? And hydrogen is an option for that.
And then over the course of breakfast, well, I think, there might be a way to just keep everything down there except the hydrogen.
Well, you find sometimes the ideas you have, they after the fact, they seem so obvious. But prior to that moment when you dream it up, it doesn't exist. Why did no one realize the prize of hydrogen?
Hydrogen is the simplest and most abundant element on Earth. It consists of only 1 proton and 1 electron. The gas can be used to generate electricity and power vehicles, and it produces water, not carbon, when burned.
In the new system that the world's trying to move to, we have a possibility of creating one big energy system that is much more interchangeable between it, which has electricity on one side of that system and on the other side hydrogen.
There are currently numerous drawbacks for hydrogen. One of the main challenges, it is still relatively expensive to produce. But perhaps more importantly, the majority of current hydrogen production uses fossil fuels that release carbons into the atmosphere. This new process has the potential to address those issues. It aims to extract hydrogen from underground resources like oil-filled deposits while leaving the carbon emissions below the surface.
When you think of oil, it's hydrocarbon. So you think, oh, okay, there's hydrogen there, there's carbon there, and a bunch of other stuff. But the thing is, if we can access and simply produce the hydrogen out, and also get that from the water that's there, then you have now an energy production process from heavy oil reservoirs, which is completely clean.
It comes down to 2 simple premises. One is that you can make hydrogen from an oil field, and that's been done more than 500 times worldwide. So in my mind, fully proven, not a question. And then the other aspect is, are there ways to separate hydrogen from a mixed gas stream? Again, We've been doing that for about 100 years, fully proven, not really an issue. Combining them in a new process that works together, where you create this hydrogen and you separate the hydrogen, that's what we do.
So what's nice about what we're doing reforming within the underground. We're rejecting the carbon oxides in the underground, and we're producing hydrogen only at surface. So this is hydrogen which is CO2 free at surface.
In order to prove the technology, the team set about building a demonstration in a laboratory at the University of Calgary. Their aim was to show a system that injects oxygen into the ground, producing hydrogen under the ground and keeping the carbon also under the ground, and then only extracting the hydrogen. Another engineer, Jackie Wong, who was also studying at the university, was also brought in for the project.
From the theoretical point of view we think this works because we can mimic the high temperature and with the formation water present, and we can do a steam in situ generation. Once the steam and the methane they met together with the high temperature region, then we think we have everything ready.
So we got the parts we needed and did this lab demonstration. They didn't all quite work together correctly, especially the seals on our unit. So I spent a few weeks in the lab with Jackie, and we were melting aluminum and trying all sorts of different gaskets to use as a seal. And finally, one worked, so we had our lab results. But it was an interesting educational thing to prove to ourselves and others that we could do it too.
We did a load of simulation work to show that we could get economic hydrogen out of the reservoir, so that gives you motivation to move forward with the program, where we can gasify oil sands and then test our membranes and show that we can produce pure hydrogen from oil sands.
Robert in Saskatchewan, Canada, is surrounded by oil sands for as far as the eye can see. In 2017, Proton Technologies purchased this oil facility. The previous owners had spent $250 million on establishing the plant. Proton picked it up at a fraction of the price. In order to carry out the company's vision in demonstrating a clean hydrogen-making technology, the company first needed income, and that meant producing oil to generate funds. SETA AFSHORDI is the Chief Operations Officer and had been the plant operations manager under the previous owners.
The very first focus was to get the operation up and running, because for Proton Technologies, this is a source of cash flow as well. Obviously, it's a startup technology company with a patent that's trying to prove a technology. Usually companies like that, they don't not have any source of cash flow. Whereas the beauty of this project, by owning this asset, we started having cash flow from day one, which was through the oil production.
Although the theory of the method had been proven in a laboratory, the next step of the operation was to prove the hydrogen technology could work in the field.
The same potential shareholder who wanted the lab demo said, okay, so I see you guys have a lab demo, but can you do it in the field? Because one of my membrane experts thinks that that H2S will destroy your membrane. And we said, no, we'll use old-fashioned membranes that can handle H2S. And he said, okay, prove it. So we did.
So the technology was proven at the lab, but it was never implemented in the field. So in the real world that you're dealing with H2S, you're dealing with very cold temperatures. It's never been tested. So they asked me to actually go ahead and come up with a process and build everything, do the engineering, do the project management to actually demonstrate that test.
That was a great success. We proved we can produce 99.9% pure hydrogen from those membranes at flux rates, which makes sense economically.
From the lab point of view, we proved the concept. From the field demonstration project, we proved we can produce 99.99999% purity hydrogen.
You go through this step of processes where it's concept, taking and lowering the risk that you can in that step to a set of simulations to lower economic risk and technical risk, to then a set of experiments where we lower risks further, then to a field trial to even show, oh yeah, produce gas, no harm to the membranes and so on.
On the night that we ended up separating pure hydrogen from our gas stream and see that blue flame, that was the most exciting night. And that's when I believed in it. And that's when I ended up putting a lot of money in this business.
Despite the success in the field, further major investment failed to materialize. More funds were needed to keep the company afloat. The operation costs at the plant continued to mount up.
We barely scraped enough together to obtain this asset at an auction for a great price, and then quickly realized that this is going to cost even more. We had to fix a bunch of things to operate it safely and properly, and everything costs a lot in the oil patch, it seems. So we were suddenly trying to, through a very challenging time of price volatility for oil in Western Canada, we had to try and hang on to this facility through oil revenues, just so we could hold it long enough to be able to get our hydrogen demo done at large scale.
We tried to actually talk to all of the local investors or banks in Calgary, and still we couldn't we didn't get the attention that we needed. So, but I saw that blue flame with my own eyes, and I'm an engineer, so I know what I'm dealing with. So I ended up remortgaging my own house, and I pulled out 2 lines of credits that I had, and then I put it into business.
There was a variety of interesting challenges that we didn't expect. For example, even just the utility bill sometimes would be, how are we going to solve this within the next 5 days before they turn the power off? And if the power turns off, things can freeze, and there's massive consequences. And if production completely halts, which it did for 7 weeks at one point, that's you have an op cost to cover and field guys to pay, no matter what.
We were very close to lose everything. Basically, we were going to lose the power and electricity here. We were supposed to use natural gas. And then it was, I would say, through a lot of prayers, we managed to find more people and then get more money into the business to survive.
But as the operation began to produce more oil, and with the price of oil improving, the company managed to hold on. The aim for the company now to begin hydrogen production at their facility on a much larger scale.
The next step is to turn on a lot of air injection and a lot of steam injection so that we can have the maximum amount of steam reforming in the ground in the near term with the hardware we have. So that'll be, we expect, between 5 and 10 tons per day of hydrogen. And the next step is 500 tons per day.
Producing clean hydrogen is one thing, but the cost remains a key challenge. Currently, 95% of hydrogen production produces carbon and requires significant outlay to build a plant. But imagine a plant that essentially uses nature instead of a huge above-ground infrastructure. Proton Technologies calculate that the new method has the potential to be a tenth of the current hydrogen production costs.
The very lowest cost steam methane reformers I've heard of was from a report in the International Energy Agency that suggests that at places with extremely low gas prices and labor costs, you can actually get down to about $1 per kilogram. And we're talking about like 10 cents per kilogram. So on a cost basis, with no emissions, that's a dramatic improvement in hydrogen cost.
And because of the abundance of these resources, when you start looking at the volume of oil and water in these systems, and you take into account even, let's say oxygen injection, so air separation to get oxygen and compression put into the underground, and you power it from the produced hydrogen, you're looking at, cost points of, 10 cents to 50 cents per kilogram hydrogen.
I think about the transition, for example, from whale oil to crude oil. It didn't happen because everyone loved whales. It happened because crude oil was inexpensive and easy to use. And I think if hydrogen is less expensive than crude oil and easy to use, and why wouldn't people change? If it's $6 to fuel up your car with hydrogen, as opposed to $60 with diesel, and one of them is healthy and makes water for you, and the other one is going to kill your neighbors when you're idling your truck, you know, it seems like an obvious solution to me.
Adding to the appeal of the system is that current energy producers, oil, gas and coal companies, also stand to gain from the process.
One of the promising things about it is it provides an opportunity for the traditional fossil fuel sector to play a major role in the transition to a low-carbon economy that would help to stimulate, create jobs, create economic opportunity, and actually make them, the fossil fuel sector, a very critical part of a transition to a low-carbon future, rather than only being seen as part of the problem.
Welcome to the ARC Energy Ideas podcast for November 22nd. I'm Jackie Forrest.
And I'm Peter Trudzakian.
But is the discovery simply too good to be true? Peter Trudzakian and Jackie Forrest of the ARC Energy Research Institute host a regular podcast. In this episode, SETA joined them to discuss the technology.
Well, it's very exciting to hear what Proton is doing. I've been involved in and around the hydrogen economy, the potential of that economy, for 20 years or so. And 20 years ago, it was still the holy grail in a sense of the potential for a clean energy system straight from hydrogen, the simplest atom.
I'm just really excited about the potential. You know, we have these huge reservoirs in Western Canada for oil and gas, and we're not alone. There's many jurisdictions in the world, right, that their economies depend on oil and gas. And as we think about the transition to a cleaner economy, there's some big questions about, you know, what are we going to do with all the people and the expertise and towns that exist in these areas? And it's exciting to think that, hey, maybe there is a way that these same reservoirs that have produced oil and gas for decades could be transitioned to producing low-cost, low-carbon hydrogen, which could really fuel the transition.
Yeah, it was hidden in full view, and so the impetus to switch has to come from a combination of different forces of change. It has to come from the environmental impetus, which has historically been a big impetus. It has to come from the technology being available. It has to come from the economics being competitive with the status quo energy system, in this case, fossil fuels. So if you can make the planets aligned and the circumstances right for the transition, then it has the potential to be adopted.
You know, one of the problems with hydrogen in the past has been the only economic way we had to produce it was using CH4, methane. And then, you know, it was zero emission hydrogen when you were using it, but the reality upstream, we had created CO2. So that was the problem I always had with hydrogen. And so, you know, if we could have cheap, greenhouse gas emission free hydrogen, it would solve a lot of problems in terms of thinking about how the world could transition to low carbon energy.
There are, though, still some questions that need answering, not least whether there is any long-term issue created by the process.
I think a big challenge that Proton Energy needs to demonstrate and deal with is how secure the CO2 is in the reservoir after they've done the process.
That will soon be put to the test, but the potential for the technology remains. The implications of producing a low-cost, carbon-free hydrogen are enormous.
It's exactly the kind of technologies that we should be investing in. It has the promise to actually provide the fuels that the world needs and drive the kind of investment and growth that that societies are looking for.
So I think the folks that will win the energy race will be the ones that find clean solutions, because the investment community will support that. The social license that's out there right now, where people are demanding, you know, triple bottom line requirements and other things like that, will demand that. And I think you've got a huge number of young folks that are kind of that 30 and younger who are very aware and are thinking about a cleaner tomorrow. And despite what energy and oil companies and other companies are thinking, those traditional models don't work. And so companies, the ones that will win the race will be the ones that adopt clean energy?
Everyone's looking for a large-scale, low-cost, carbonless energy solution, and I think we have it.